Hello everyone, and welcome back to Gateways 2. If you don't know, today we're going to be talking about intervals and chords. And yeah, let's just jump right into it with, what exactly is an interval? Well, looking at an interval, it's basically the foundation to harmony, and what an interval actually is it's the difference between the pitches of two sounds. Now, if you didn't see Gateways 2, which was yesterday, we went over an entire episode on pitch, hertz, and resonance, and the like. So if you are confused about anything in this interval section revolving around pitch, I'd recommend going and give that one a listen. And if you still don't understand it, then in the link to that podcast episode and this one, and any future ones, there's going to be a Google form that you can fill out for anything you don't understand or anything you want to be talked about in the future. So for this first section, we're going to be referring to Berklee Harmony 1. So let's start off with, again. So when you're looking at something like the major scale or whatever scale you're in, it's comprised of whole steps and half steps, and you need a method to identify the relationship between any two notes at any position within a scale. So in order to do this, you need a way of showing that distance, so you have an interval. And it's just it's a numerical way of representing the distance between different intervals, like on the staff, for example. Now, there are a lot of different intervals that exist. There are ones that are considered perfect, there are ones that are considered major, minor, augmented, and diminished, etc. And I'm gonna start going over some of those today, which, starting off with, the most important one is something known as the perfect fifth. Now, you heard me talk about it before, but the perfect fifth is 700 cents distance between two pitches, or 7 half steps, 7 semitones. And the reason why the perfect fifth itself is so important is because it's present in nearly every single tuning system throughout history. It's a very constant interval, which means that the ratio between the two frequencies is very simple, which is why our ears enjoy it. It's a ratio of 3 to 2. And it's also very useful for resolution back to a tonic in key center. So now let's start going over some of the other basic intervals. So if we're in a major scale and we're only using the notes from a major scale, such as let's just use C major because it's the simplest one to use. You have C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, which is the order of notes on the staff and on the piano. Now, if you play a C and a C at the exact same pitch, that's just called a unison pitch. They're exactly the same, and the ratio is 1:1. Following that, you have C and D, which is 2 semitones apart. That's a major second. You have a major third, which is 4 semitones apart from the tonic. So C to E is a major third. You have a perfect fourth, which is a C to an F, right? Which is 5 semitones apart. You have the perfect fifth, which, like I said previously, is 7, which would be C to G. You have the major sixth, which would be 9 semitones apart, and it would be C to A. You have a major seventh, which is interesting. That's 11 semitones away from, so that would be like C to B, and then you have a perfect octave, which is C to its octave C, 12 semitones above. Now, something that needs to be talked about is, dissonance in music. How does dissonance work? Because that'll help explain, a lot of intervals, like why they sound specific ways. So let's just go over with just the major and perfect intervals of a major scale. So if you're to play a perfect fifth, it sounds very constant because, again, the ratio is really simple. Whereas if you played something like a major seventh, right, it sounds a little more dissonant. Now, it's like a little crunchy. It's a little difficult to listen to if not put in the right context. alone, it's dissonant, which is, the term that we use as musicians to describe like how something feels. And if you look at like how exactly do you define the word dissonant? It's like a clash. It's two notes that have a sound that, because of the ratio of the frequencies, it's strange to listen to. So in the example of the major seventh in this case, the reason why it's so dissonant is because the ratio between the two notes is 15 to 8. Now that does not sound like a very good ratio it's not a very simple ratio, which is why our ears don't enjoy it as much as something like a perfect fifth, which is 3 to 2. Or something like a major third, which is a 5 to 3. Another good example is if you play something called a tritone. Now a tritone is 6 semitones away from the root note. So if it's C, its tritone is F sharp, and it divides the octave perfectly into 2 halves. But when you play that frequency, it's a ratio of the square root of 2 to 1, because it's dividing essentially the octave in half, where the octave is 2 to 1, and it's a logarithmic system for calculating these ratios. So that would mean it would be the square root of 2 to 1. Now that ratio is complex and it's more difficult for our ears to understand, which is why it sounds so dissonant. Now, of course, these can be used in certain more advanced harmonic structures, which we'll talk about later, but just the interval itself is very dissonant. Now, here's another fun one, another fun piece of information. So the perfect fourth, or the 5 semitones, so C to F in this case, when played by itself, the reason why it's perfect is because it's part of what's called a plagal cadence, right? You have a perfect cadence, which is 5 to 1, because it's a perfect fifth, and you have a plagal cadence, which is a 4 to 1. Now this has to do with something called the circle of fifths, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but something interesting is that the perfect fourth can act as either consonant or dissonant. Now what do I mean by that? Well, when you play a perfect fourth alone, it does sound very pleasing to the ear. If I can remember, I believe the ratio is 4 to 3, so it's a fairly simple ratio. However, the reason why it sounds so strange is because the reason why it can act dissonant is because the perfect fourth doesn't exist in something called the harmonic series. Now the harmonic series works in that, like, if you play a note, that pitch isn't the only one that's being, that your ears can hear. Or actually, like, it's a descending list of different pitches at different intervals, which our ears actually hearing. The perfect fourth doesn't actually exist in that, which is interesting, which is why if you were to play, I'll talk in chords because we'll be going over chords more later. If you were to play something like C sus4, which is C, F, and G, and then you play a C major, which is C, E, and G, that resolution makes the perfect fourth sound dissonant, even though the ratio is simple. So that's just an interesting way to think about it. The perfect fourth is kind of like it's a middle ground. It's kind of similar with the major second too. Like, I know something I like to do is, like, you can do the sus4 to major. You can also do sus2 to major, which I like. I think it sounds nice. Anyway, so continuing forward, there's a lot of other interval types that you have, right? You have of course you have the major ones. You have the minor ones, which is when an interval is made smaller by lowering the top note or raising the bottom note a half step. So in the example of, like, a minor second, which would be in C major, it would be C and C flat or D sharp. that would be a minor second, whereas the major second is a C to a D. Something fun about, a minor second, it sounds like the old horror movie sound effect for someone getting stabbed. It's a fun fact. Then you also have things like the minor third, whereas the major third, in the case of C, would be C to E. A minor third could either be C sharp to E or C to E flat. And of course this applies to all the intervals, including one of the more dissonant ones I talked about before, the major seventh. A minor seventh kind of develops the quality of a major second instead of what it had previously. Like, in relation to C, because in the harmonic series you hear the octave of a pitch first. If you play a C and then the B above it, your ear can also hear the C directly next to B on the piano, which is why it sounds dissonant, because it's like a minor second. It's like two notes which are chromatically directly next to each other being played at the same time. When you use a minor seventh, you're giving it the same, almost like the same distance as a major second instead, where, it's a bit easier to resolve. So, that's how that would work. You also have, diminished chords, which is when you take a minor or a perfect interval and you decrease it by a half step or a semitone. So in the case of like the perfect fourth, which was in the case of C, it was a C to an F. It's now a C to an E because that's a semitone below, which is technically a major third, but it can also be called a diminished fourth. Same with like the fifth. It can be like a C to a G is now a C to an F sharp, which, as I said before, is a tritone. That's what a diminished fifth is. Or you have like the diminished sixth, which is you take the minor sixth, which was C to A flat, and you can do something like C sharp to A flat instead. And you also have like diminished octave, which would be, let's say a C to its octave C, take that down a half step, that's C to a B, that's a major seventh or a diminished octave. And then you also have the augmented, which is when you take a major or a perfect interval and increase it by a half step. So you have things like the augmented fifth, which is a C to a G sharp, etc. It applies to all of them. And you can also do things like double diminished and double augmented, which is just when you like diminish a diminished interval by a half step or augment an augmented interval by a half step. You can also have intervals which exceed the octave, whereas like if you have a C and then you skip the E that is 4 semitones and you instead go to the octave E, you can call that a major tenth, or you can just call it a major third. It's just intervals are kind of just a way of categorizing music in general. And then you also have something called interval inversion, right? So you can, because an interval is the distance between two pitches specifically, you can make them appear in sound in two different ways. So let's say you have a major third, right? Actually no, let's say major second. Major second would be a little bit easier. So you have a major second, so that's a C and a D. Now let's say the D is 2 semitones from the tone, the tonic. That's C, C sharp, D. That's the D you're playing. On the staff, that would be represented with on one ledger line down you have a note, and then on the bottom of the bottommost line of the staff you have a note. If you want to invert that, what you do is you take the C, which is on the bottom, and you'd put it to its octave. And that is known as the inversion of that interval. When an interval is inverted, the notes are still the same, the name is still the same. However, you can refer to them as either like, the interval of a C to a D is a major second, but if you invert it, like I said previously, it's now a minor 7. You know, so, you know, a good way to think about it, if you don't want to forget, is that if you take 9, like the number 9, right, and you subtract the original interval, then you'll get the inverted one. For example, in the case of that major second, you have like 9 minus the second, the major second, gives you the 7th, or the minor 7. Now, for like major and minor, when you invert a major interval, it becomes minor. When you invert a minor interval, it becomes major. And that's just something good to keep in mind. Perfect intervals will always be perfect. However, a fifth will convert to a fourth, and a fourth will convert to a fifth. And that will be seen later on the circle of fifths. Now, augmented become diminished, diminished become augmented, you know, double diminished, double augmented, double augmented, double diminished. They basically become their opposite when you invert them. Which is something that's, you know, it's pretty easy to keep in mind whenever you're, you know, like doing something like writing a different chord voicing. And now we can start discussing some chord structures. Now, what are chords? Well, today we're going to start off with the most basic chord, which is the humble triad, right? So you have the triad. Triad is made up of, as the name suggests, 3 different pitches. Let's take a major, because major is the easiest. It's the easiest one to start off with. You have the note. We're in C major, and we're going to play the tonic major chord. So that would be C major. That would be C, E, and G. Now, why did we, you know, talk about all this interval stuff when you can just remember, oh, it's the C with a major third and a perfect fifth? Well, the way that major, minor, diminished, and augmented chords work is it's the interval relationship between the different pitches, right? So let's diagnose like a C major chord. Let's look at what it really is. So you have C, E, and G. Well, a C to an E is a major third, right? And then a C to a G is a perfect fifth. Now, that's nice and dandy, you know, but what about an E to a G? Well, an E to a G actually ends up being a minor third, right? Now this is important because you notice in this major chord, you have C to E as major third, and E to G is minor third, right? Now let's look at the minor. So you have C minor, the C minor chord. That is C, E flat, and G. Well, a C to an E flat is a minor third, and an E flat to a G is a major third. So, in moving from the major to the minor chord, the intervals, like the intervals between each of the notes, swapped. Now, why is this? Well, you know, if I'm doing this right, then you've probably been hearing examples of these chords throughout. The feeling of major and minor triad specifically changes a lot with the third, because the third is very important in, you know, creating harmony, because the interval relationships past it and like the sound that it creates are all kind of dependent on the third. Now, for those of you who don't know, because I should have said this a little bit earlier, I guess, but a chord is when 3 or more pitches are played simultaneously, right? So keeping that in mind, when you're creating a chord, you're basically trying to create a set of notes which fulfill a function. At least you're doing functional harmony or non-functional harmony, An easy way to describe it is it's like you're adding color. If your melody is like, a sketch, then your chords are like, shading, adding color, all the fun visual art jargon. It's making what you've produced more interesting. So, triad's the most basic kind. You have seventh chords. You have, C major minor 7, sharp 9, flat 13. And, that may sound really complicated, but it's not as weird and, hard to understand as you might think it is. But, again, so, I just told you about the major triad and the minor triad. You also have things like, augmented and diminished triads, which come from things like, how do I describe this? Okay, so like I said before, you have the C major. C major, you have C, E, and G. So that's a perfect fifth from C to G, a major third from C to E, and a minor third from E to G. Now a diminished triad would be if you take the minor, which is C, E flat, G, and you take that G down a half step. So now what you have is a minor between C and E flat, and a minor third between E flat and F sharp. And that's also like a diminished fifth. A diminished fifth away from C. So like C to F sharp is a diminished fifth, C to E flat is minor, and E flat to G is minor. Now the opposite of this is the augmented chord, which it would be C, E, G sharp, in which now you have an augmented fifth from C to G sharp, you have a major from C to E, and you have a major third from E to G sharp. Now this is why the intervals come into play, because if you can just remember these interval relationships, it makes figuring out a chord a lot easier. Because a lot of the times you'll just see written on a page E flat sus4 major 7 flat 9, and you're like, I don't know what that is. But if you remember the interval relationships between those things, it just makes learning to play it a lot easier. It makes learning to use it a lot easier. And that's just how you do. Excellent job, me. So now let's move on as a brief tidbit and a brief introduction to what the next one we'll be talking about. The next gateways 4, is seventh chords. Now, if you've been listening to these these triads, you notice that, they're a little boring sometimes, they're a little bland. They could use some color. That's where the extensions come in. The first extension being the seventh. Now, I won't get into that yet because I do want to talk about it more in depth later. So today we're just going to stick to triads. But we do have a little assignment. I know, assignments are boring. Don't worry, this one's quick. There's a piece of music, a little PDF that I've put in the description of this video, even though it's a podcast. And all I want you to do is I want you to write the intervals of notes of the chords on that page. Why? Because then you can start getting used to seeing them. And then if you want to, since I gave you that assignment earlier about writing that piece of music, you can try to implement these, with different chords and see how it goes. So, again, thank you for listening. I hope you all have a swell morning, evening, noon, afternoon, night, whatever time it is. I hope you guys are like staying healthy with the whole quarantine business, and wish you all well. As for like when that assignment is due, it's just before the next podcast, which should be coming out on Saturday relative to today, so that'll be in April. So, at least for me, good night, everyone.